course, Lebanon is living multiple crises. First of all, it is the biggest economic depression in Lebanese history, if not in world history. We have output declining by some 45%, which is in real terms, which is unprecedented. Inflation, of course, as we know, is about 150%. Unemployment is north of 40% of the population. There is massive migration, as you know, as you can see from the pictures at the airport. And of course, all of this has also meant that massive poverty and inequality. The World Bank and the United Nations estimate that poverty rates now reach 65% of the Lebanese population. Food poverty is around 35% of the population. This is really truly unprecedented. Now, why did we get here? We got here as a result of multiple crises happening at the same time. But the fundamental reasons why we got here was because of unsustainable level of debt, both government debt and central bank debt, BDL debt, a balance of payments deficit which became increasingly unsustainable, and an overvalued Lebanese pound. Those three things together led to unsustainable macroeconomic conditions, resulting in the crisis that we now are living through. Unfortunately, the borrowing that government undertook did not go to build real assets, did not go to build infrastructure. And the borrowing by the central bank was to defend an overvalued Lebanese pound. So it went to pay high interest. This was called financial engineering, but in effect, it was a Ponzi scheme. It was borrowing to pay interest and previous borrowing. Eventually, higher interest rates meant higher budget deficits. The overvalued pound meant that we imported even more and exported even less. And all of this collapsed. So we have a bubble that burst at the end of 2019, and we're living the consequences since then. For my own part, I left the central bank in 2003, so that's nearly 20 years ago. At that time, the banking system, the economy were performing reasonably well. I had warned about budget deficits. I had warned about the exposure of the banking system to government lending. But unfortunately, politics was the major factor which continued. And what I mean by politics is corruption. Much of the spending, unfortunately, went to waste, financed increasingly corruption by politicians. And we're living the consequences right now. Well, you know, Lebanon is a highly dollarized economy, which means that we import a lot of the goods, and the exchange rate plays an important part in the pricing of goods and services. So with the collapse of the exchange rate system, the peg exchange rate system, prices started rising accordingly. And then you got continuing financing of the government budget deficit. Monetary financing of budget deficits means that you inject more money into the system. So the money supply quadrupled over the past 2 years. As a result of that, inflation kept on going. And unfortunately, unless you get substantial, deep reforms, we're heading towards hyperinflation, i.e., there is no limit to the increase in prices or to the depreciation of the exchange rate. You need fundamental reforms, monetary reform, fiscal reform, restructuring of the banking and financial sector, structural reforms, for example, for electricity, social security. All of that needs to be done. Otherwise, if you don't have a vision as to where those reforms will be coming from, there is no limit to price increases and exchange rate depreciation. Okay, usually subsidies, we go back to economic principles. Subsidies is a tool for government policies, right? It is for governments to undertake subsidies or not to undertake subsidies. Now, how the subsidies are financed is usually they're financed within the budget. Why do you want to put them in the budget? Because it ensures transparency. You know where the money is coming from, you know where the money is going. Unfortunately, that is not the case in Lebanon. The current subsidy regime was ill-designed to begin with. It is generalized subsidies. Usually subsidies have to be highly targeted. If you want to help the poor and the needy, you organize the subsidies to help the poor and the needy. The way the subsidy program was designed in the case of Lebanon is it was generalized, so anybody could benefit from it. My estimates are that only 20% of the subsidies went to help the poor and the needy. 80% went into smuggling, mostly into Syria, into the pockets of traders and wholesalers, whether it's for medicines, fuel, or other goods. So badly designed. On top of that, it was financed by the central bank using depositor monies. These are what are called legal reserve requirements, but in effect, it is depositor money from the banks. This is, of course, a mistake, but also misuse of other people's money without their approval, right? Without the approval of depositors. The subsidy system should stop. It needs to be replaced by targeted subsidies, cash transfers to the poor and the needy. We know how to do that. The World Bank can help us. And so in my view, the subsidy program should stop immediately, and we should stop the system of having multiple exchange rates. If we look at other major crises, financial crises, banking crises, economic crises, such as Chile in 1926, Spain during the Civil War, it took them 10 to 15 years to come out of crisis. Those were mainly political events. There was a coup and there was a civil war. It is difficult to estimate when Lebanon could re-emerge. It depends on whether or not you have reforms and whether or not you have a credible government in place that will implement those reforms, and Parliament will enact the laws required for those reforms. I would guess if I had to start a program right now, which means agreeing with international donors, agreeing with the IMF, if we could do that immediately over the next 3 months, that it would take us maybe 5 to 7 years to start re-emerging. In the meantime, what it also means is that unfortunately, you will have continuing poverty and unemployment, and it'll take us a long time to recover the level of output that we had in 2018, 2019. I think you need to divide it into short-term and medium and long-term. The short-term requirements has to be focused on humanitarian requirements. That is for alleviating poverty, for education, for food security, for health security. There, I think the World Bank and others have estimated that we need what's called the social safety net of around $1 billion to $1.5 billion. And this has to be targeted. This has to go to the poor and needy. The number of poor and needy, because of the crisis, is increasing. We mentioned the numbers in terms of poverty and unemployment. So I would guess about $1.5 billion. We can get that, I think, very possibly through humanitarian aid. As you know, there was a recent meeting organized by France that promised some 370 million at the donor conference. There is some 546 million in loans from the World Bank that we can use. And I think if there is a credible government in place, then I think we can get some 500 million from the Gulf countries, the European Union, and other world donors. That is feasible. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to address the humanitarian crisis. Second thing is to start the process of reform. And this needs to be done even before there are elections next year. I think the international community, by which I mean World Bank, IMF, international financial institutions, as well as countries in the GCC, EU, and elsewhere, China, Russia, etc., are willing to help Lebanon. There is a big possibility there. However, given the past record of our politicians and governments of corruption, waste, bribery, cronyism, and mismanagement, nobody will want to give aid if there are no reforms. You have to improve governance. You have to stop corruption. If that is not going to happen, then nobody will want to give aid to government. As you've seen already, the aid that has come to government has not, to Lebanon, has not gone to government. It's gone to NGOs, civil society organizations, and to the private sector, because there is no trust in government, and also no trust in the banking sector. So unless you restore trust, it'll be difficult for the international community to act. The gold that we have is what we call a reserve asset. It should be backing the banking and financial system. It should be backing for the currency. Okay? We should not be using that to finance government or anything else. If we are going to use the gold, it should be part of an overall stabilization and reconstruction plan for Lebanon. What I mean by that is that if we start a program with the IMF that would be providing us with financing along with the international community, then we could consider using the gold as part of the overall financial package that would be required for stabilization and reconstruction. Otherwise, you run the big danger of trying to use the gold right now. It gets wasted like other resources got wasted, and that would be a disaster for Lebanon. I think Lebanon would need to consider issuing a new currency, a new lira, and abolishing the old currency. The reason is that we're getting close to hyperinflation. Unless there are reforms, you are going to get hyperinflation. By hyperinflation, I mean that prices would increase every month by more than 25%. We are not there yet. But unless we reform, we will be getting there very quickly. Already you're hearing that there are requests for cost of living adjustment, right? Government has just approved, and the president has just approved 600 billion to give 1 month salary for the public sector. They want to give transport allowances, right? Without additional revenues. What that means is that you'll be printing more money. And as you print more money, inflation will go up. So what you give in terms of cost of living increases will be destroyed by inflation. And then people will ask for more cost of living adjustments, which will lead to more financing of deficits by the central bank, which will lead to more inflation, and you go into an inflationary cycle. This is what we need to avoid. So if you don't stop that, then inflation will continue. So you need an overall package of reform measures to arrest inflation. We need shock treatment. The banking sector today is illiquid, but also insolvent. The reason why it is insolvent is because it lent to the central bank, and the central bank used those deposits, which were attracted by high interest rates, okay, to in part finance government, but also in order to defend the pound, as we said. The money that was used to defend the pound resulted in high interest being paid, and much of that money left the country. The result was enormous losses at the central bank, in excess of $60 billion. Now, the banking sector by the end of 2019 had something like 75% of its assets at the central bank and in government treasury bills and Eurobonds. The value of those has been reduced substantially. If you look at the value of your Eurobond in the market, it is selling at 12 cents on the dollar. So it's lost 88% of its value. That means that the holdings of the banks, including their holdings of central bank certificates of deposits and bonds and others, have also been reduced. So enormous losses that they have. Now, how do you resolve that? What you need is a bail-in by the shareholders of the banks. What do we mean by bail-in? We mean by bail-in that they need to have an equity injection. They have to provide cash to the banks. You have to sell some of your assets abroad, subsidiaries, investments that you have abroad. Some of the banks have started doing that. In addition to that, you have to reduce your size in Lebanon. The banking sector that we had before the crisis was too big for the size of the economy. So in my view, we have to reduce the size by at least 50%, if not more. That means a total restructuring of the banking sector, reducing the number of banks, merging others, clearing out insolvent banks and shutting them down. And typically what happens in this case is you create a bank resolution fund. The bad assets of the banks are all put into a separate fund, and you resolve that over time. That, in my view, is what needs to be done. Otherwise, you'll end up with what we call a zombie banking system, which is unable to help the private sector. The government had no choice because it was running out of reserves in any case. The crisis really started in October 2019, not in March 2020. Why do I say October 2019? It is because a decision was taken by the central bank and the banks to shut down the banks in October, if you recall, for several weeks. That created panic. And when you shut down the banks, and this had never happened in Lebanon's history, people rushed to the banks as soon as they open to want to get their money out because they're afraid that the banks might close again. And this is what led to a bank run and eventually the banking and financial crisis. It was not the decision not to pay the March Eurobond. Now, the mistake the government did at the time in March was not to start negotiation with the debtors. What you need is what we call an orderly restructuring of the debt. Normally, in a crisis like this time, you would call in all your creditors, all the holders of the debt. You sit down around the table and you say, I'm going to pay you, but it's going to take me time. I also want you to reduce the value of the debt, a haircut on the debt. Unfortunately, the government did not do that. They were incompetent in dealing with the crisis. But the crisis really started back in October. Well, of course, there is no fundamental reason for that, and it is illegal. There is no justification for the banks to do that. The money had been deposited by the companies. They want to pay their employees. What, however, the central bank is trying to do is to reduce liquidity in the banking system. by allowing such measures. But what such measures do is they create even less confidence, and they lead to disintermediation from the banking system. What you're now doing is you're reducing Lebanon into a pure cash economy. And when you do that, output activity declines because you can no longer use the banks for credit or for payments. This is a big mistake that the banks are doing. If you have to regain customer trust, because we need the banking system. But in order to do that, as I said, you have to recapitalize the banks. That means a big injection of around $20 billion by the shareholders of the bank through selling subsidiaries, investments, and other. Of course, the shareholders will tell you that I will not do that unless there is an overall macroeconomic plan and reform to stabilize the economy and to start reconstruction. So these things have got to go together. To rebuild the trust, you need a bail-in by the banks, but the bail-in of the banks needs to be accompanied by a plan to stabilize the economy, fiscal reforms, structural reforms, and as well international aid and financing from the IMF, World Bank, Europeans, EIB, EBRD, and others, and the GCC countries, of course, above all else. Well, the central bank is responsible for the soundness and stability of the banking system. Clearly, the banking system has failed. There is no longer trust in the banking and financial system. And apart from the high level of debt of government, the central bank played a major role. And obviously, the fixed exchange rate policy, financial engineering, and financing, continuing financing of government, as well as quasi-fiscal activities, that is, subsidies that are given for real estate, for SMEs and others, have failed. Basically, the banks have got to be solvent, become solvent again, and they have to have the liquidity. Again, that will only be happening if you have a bail-in of the banks, if you have at least 20 billion injected into the banking system from shareholders and maybe new investors. Before that, I don't see that the banks will be able to do anything. In addition to that, you need a capital control act. We have advocated having capital controls back in October 2019, before the crisis. Unfortunately, Parliament did not pass any law. And as long as you don't have any capital controls, it means that the substantial amount of remittances that come to Lebanon, remittances are continuing, 6 to 7 billion come into Lebanon, right? But now they're not coming into the banks. They come in as cash, and they're not going into the banking system because there is no trust and confidence.